Welcome to the Insert Philosophy Here podcast. Inserting the principles of philosophy into real life. As some of you know, I am a university professor in philosophy, and I'd like to share today one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about education, especially higher education. I was fortunate enough to go to university at a time when it was affordable. It wasn't that long ago. But back then, tuition was under $3,000 a year, and a combination of Pell Grants and working part-time jobs could pay for your education. It wasn't that long ago. That was back when university work-study jobs offered meaningful academic-related employment with adequate compensation. And a brief aside here, because this is a pet peeve of mine, when I was an undergraduate, it was possible to work about 400 work-study hours over the course of an academic year to pay for your tuition for the whole year. But today's students, if they even have work-study jobs available, would have to work over 2,000 work-study hours. In other words, work full-time for a whole year to be able to afford their college tuition, which obviously that's not possible. Anyway, rant over, back to my tale. Because recently, a news story reminded me of two work-study jobs from which I benefited, and not only financially. They were piddly grunt jobs, to be sure, but they were far more than working as a cashier at the rec hall, which is pretty much all you have these days as work-study jobs. But those two jobs, those academic jobs, immersed me in history and ideas that opened up my eyes and expanded my horizons. The first of these work-study jobs was as a research assistant. Now, that job title makes it sound far more prestigious than it was. I was a dog's body for a political science professor who was as dull as dirt. Well, to be honest, dirt was sparkling excitement compared to this guy. Nothing against him, but he was dull. His research project was also fairly soporific. He was drafting a paper on the history of the unanimous consent decree in the U.S. Senate before 1920. He was particularly curious about the use of the parliamentary procedure before and after a particular rule about it was established in 1914. Fair enough, that's part of academia. Now, my job, I was tasked to find all mentions of unanimous consent mentioned during Senate proceedings as recorded in the Senate Journal, the official record of the Senate activities. Keep in mind, this was in the olden days before anyone had digitized books. And yes, I'm dating myself here, but it's not that long ago. To find the requested information from the professor, I had to go into the stacks of the university library and pull out the physical hardcover copies of the Senate Journal. I dutifully pulled every volume of the Senate Journal from 1874 to 1919, skimmed through every page, and wrote down every page on which the words unanimous consent appeared and to what bill or motion the request referred. And yes, I'm sure I was the first person to open some of these volumes. The 1890s in particular seem to have attracted very little interest. Being a curious sort, I read many of the journal entries detailing the Senate's business. It was all fairly new to me. What struck me more than all the rest of what I read was how many bills were introduced for workers' rights, especially for the relief of railroad workers. Year after year, multiple bills were introduced attempting to cap the number of hours that corporations could require their employees to work. What shocked me was that the proposed caps were 60 hours for the work week and 10 or 12 hours for the work day. That was like to lower the amount of hours to 10 or 12 a day. What shocked me even more was that year after year, these bills were voted down by the senators. The journals usually didn't include floor speeches, especially the oldest volumes, but sometimes there were summaries of what senators presented in support of their workers' rights bills. There were multiple mentions of how many thousands of railroad workers were killed on the job each year, which were understandably attributed in part to workers being overworked. There were also massive safety issues that other bills tried to address, bills also usually voted down. Between 1890 and 1917, there were 230,000 on-the-job deaths of railroad workers in the U.S. This was a major reason for railroad workers to form labor unions to demand better safety for workers. The railroad unions eventually succeeded. In 1916, when they threatened a nationwide strike, and with World War I looming, Congress passed the Adamson Act that granted rail workers the protection of an 8-hour day. Because of Adamson and other worker protection acts of Congress, railroad worker deaths decreased from over 8,000 a year to under 12 a year today. It shocked me then, and it still bothers me now, that the U.S. Senate opposed the idea that people shouldn't be forced to work over 12 hours a day, and opposed that for decades before a war and labor activism finally forced their hand. Later, I took on a work-study job for the Women's Studies Department at my university to catalog their library. Well, to call it a library was generous, as the professor I reported to readily admitted. It was the first department to offer a major in women's studies ever in the United States, and they were justifiably proud of who they were and what they had accomplished. Like all women's studies departments, however, they were drastically underfunded, which is why they were hiring me to do this. And their offices were relegated to one of the oldest buildings on campus, their library, such as it was, being a small attic room in literally the oldest building on campus. The task assigned to me was to go through the second-hand shelving units and cabinets, and the considerable number of cardboard boxes that held hundreds of books collected by the department over the years. We really don't know what we have, the professor told me, and my job was to create their card catalog, writing down each book's title, author, and subject matter. Yes, on paper. My students today don't even know what a paper index card catalog is. Naturally, I can't pick up a book without leafing through it and trying to understand what's going on with it. Those books were my first exposure to feminism, feminist philosophy, queer studies, and related subjects. I was granted permission to check some of these books out of the library, and I read those books. I didn't agree with all of them. I confess I didn't understand them all, but I did learn from them all. I also confess that I had a very stilted upbringing. Growing up in an all-white middle-class suburb in Minnesota has that effect. Meanwhile, the realities that blue-collar workers and women were treated abysmally is something many people have always known. But for me, learning about those realities was transforming. I'm not saying I had an instantaneous Zen enlightenment. I am saying that those two jobs, those two experiences, planted seeds in me that contributed toward my general awareness of social injustice, an awareness that continues to grow the more I learn, and I still have a lot to learn. Learning about other people's lives opens one's mind. It is why education, especially the liberal arts in higher education, is so important. There's a whole big world out there, and people benefit from learning about it. I know I did, and I want to pass that experience and that learning along to my students today. And that's why I am so passionate about education. Thank you for listening to the Insert Philosophy Here podcast. Please subscribe and go to insertphilosophyhere.com to see my other offerings. You can support the Insert Philosophy Here project with a donation at ko-fi.com. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.